Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about something that came up in one of my sessions, and it feels important to talk about beyond. And it was a really interesting conversation about, essentially, the best I can distill it, is the importance of independence in our lives in creating healthier bonds with other people. If I telescope out further, and you'll hear me talk about this today, it's essentially how we begin independency. And as we move towards independence, that independence is not only in the service of the individual, it is actually in the service of our relationships, that it actually creates healthy and secure attachments if we continue to practice independence in our lives. Now, some of you might be scratching your heads and saying yeah, okay, of course independence is important in any relationship, but let me kind of convey the dilemma or kind of how this topic came about, and then I'll go through some correlates and how we recurrently see this in human development. So what had come up is this idea in this particular instance, a romantic partnership and a challenge when it comes to the balance between time spent together versus time spent apart. And, this is an important balance to strike. I think anybody who's been in a long-term relationship can identify to a certain degree that it's absolutely important and imperative to spend a lot of time together and to grow together as a couple. And yet, what can often fall to the wayside is more independent activities, something apart and aside from one's partner. And this can indeed be dangerous. If you are basically doing your own thing and you're never really connecting with your partner, then you're neglecting the relationship. But there's a healthy way to engage this. And I think some people will confuse that sort of independence could be only at the disservice rather than at the service of intimacy and connection within a partnership. So why would this be the case? Well, this is where, I began to reflect on how we see this cycle in various aspects in our life. The earliest being early development, that very early on, obviously, dependency is incredibly high because when we're infants, there's literally no other way. But even as we are young children moving towards adolescence, we are still heavily dependent upon our parents or caregivers or whoever's helping raise us. And this dependency is essential in establishing a better sense of ourselves, how things work in this world. Obviously, that can be interrupted by trauma or adversity, but if things are generally healthy, it's a really important formative time. However, like clockwork, when we get towards adolescence, this is a really important time for burgeoning and increasing levels of independence, and that independence is actually quite essential to healthily attach to other people. If we remain dependent upon those in our lives early on and we don't, this kind of failure to launch, or it's a thing, we won't develop not only a very secure sense of ourselves, but a secure sense of our relationships. And that independence is absolutely vital. In the long run, it's in the service of looping back around and learning to depend healthily on people. So you can kind of think of it in an ideal circumstances almost like an overcorrection. This might not be an extreme overcorrection if you're looking back on your life, and there are certainly people, myself included, that did not engage in the overcorrection. Personally, I would believe at the detriment of my development, and perhaps in your story too. But we go from dependency to increasing and sometimes extreme levels of independence to then find our way back to a more secure way of relating. That we understand what it is like to depend, just like we understand what it is like to be independent and to stand on our own two feet, which creates a healthier attachment, a healthier ability to relate to other people. We also see this in other areas in our life. Even cultural identity development is theorized to involve a similar process. To walk you through the process, I think I probably mentioned this on an episode or two somewhere along the way. There's initially a period of over-identification, or just heavy identification in general, to the majority culture, whatever it might be. And this is not just talking about like racial identity development. I mean, literally this happens to anybody in any culture. And what happens is areas of difference are de-emphasized. But it's in the service of understanding like the powers that be. Whatever system it is that I currently exist in, I need to pay attention to, and I find ways to identify with. And that's really important developmentally. However, I'm going to talk about identity development, cultural identity development. If you are in more of a minority or there are things that are different from the majority culture, eventually that begins to be noticed. But that noticing process does not immediately lead to this even, Steven, nice, clean way of interacting with the majority culture. Instead, often there comes a tide of disidentification. This is separate and different and not me. It does not understand or represent me. I am not going to partake. I am not going to do this particular thing because I'm not that and I don't need to be that. And that is also wildly important for identity development, because it is a vacillation between these two potential extremes. And the ideal over time is to once again come back to the middle, to honor oneself independent of the majority culture, yet simultaneously understand ways to interact healthily and even identify with majority culture, because both are important and relevant. And if you feel like the identification piece is somehow a betrayal, au contraire, all societies since the dawn of time have formed around identification with whatever the majority culture is. Again, this is not just talking about race. We're talking about any norms, any common truths. All of these things we both need to be aware of and be at least bought into to some degree, while also having healthy skepticism and individuality against them. This is the yin and yang of many forces in life. And so full circle, this independence, sometimes this stark independence, is essential for actually coming back and having a healthier relationship with a greater system, never mind an individual partnership. We also see the ramifications when it doesn't go so well. When it doesn't go so well, you can look at older generations, and sometimes what ends up happening is a little bit of a cliche and stereotype to this, but older generations, at least here in the States, is women being largely subservient to the men in their lives, and again, more often heterosexual relationships when we're talking about the 40s, 50s, and so on. But within this relationship and within that sort of subservience, intentional or not, conscious or not, comes an imbalance of forces, that there is a dependency that begins to be formed where frequently the man is overly dependent on the woman, but the woman is indeed dependent on the man in some ways, often financially when we talk about older generations. But it forms what could look like a balance. But that lack of independence over time, as they get into year 10, year 15, 20, 30, 50 years into a relationship, begins to wear pretty significantly. And the cliche or stereotype that I talked about is, this sort of older woman who rediscovers herself and goes out and gets artsy earrings, artsy glasses, goes out and does all sorts of things, and the husband's just kind of chilling at home watching the news and getting angry at the world. That's not always the case. Sometimes there's communal coming together and exploration, et cetera, but the stereotype exists for a reason. And it is indicative of what happens when both parties are not continuing to discover themselves independent of one another. They're not evolving. They're not evolving with the times. And while you can evolve together, sometimes that separation of self to be sure you're both individually exploring oneself is extremely important for the ongoing health and evolution of a relationship. And many of these older couples are not successful in that, or at least one party becomes successful and the other is left behind, not because it's the responsibility of the other partner, but because it's hard to shift out of that stagnation. It truly is. And so being proactive about that is incredibly important. There's even another parallel when folks are in therapy and they're going to therapy, and that's a whole other relationship apart and aside from their partnership. Now, it's not uncommon. I have many, many folks who will then go and they tell me they will share what happened in therapy with their partners. And obviously, though, that's a distillation. It's not like an exact replication of what we talked about, but there is a sharing process. But, it still honors an independent thing, that there is sufficient trust in that relationship that one or both, especially both, can go to their own therapists and have their own lives of things that they process. And it's not like they're both obscuring completely the worlds. I mean, that can't happen. I will be clear. But generally speaking, there is things that are communally known, and there are things talked about in therapy that are just never quite talked about within that partnership. And that's okay. if not, that is essential and vital. It in many ways replicates healthy friendships in people's lives, where they go and they can hang out with their friends, and what they talk about with their friends might be very similar. There's still something very unique about what can be talked about with a friend versus a partner. And in all of this to say, to loop back around to the original point, the independence in our lives, ongoing independent exploration of ourselves, is essential for healthy attachment in our relationships. We cannot constantly be melded together. We cannot be enmeshed, essentially, in our relationships and continue to be healthy both in that relationship and as individuals. This is the nature of being relational creatures. There's an ongoing process of discovery that happens in tandem with people and apart and aside from those people. This is the healthiest way to continue to evolve and to continue to grow as an individual. And you might not think it, but I can guarantee it, and to grow in your partnership. Now, one important caveat, and forgive me if I already alluded to or spoke to this directly, you have to be willing to go back to your partner and actually share what's going on in your journey. I mean, truly, if you both separate out and you're living alternate lives and you never come back and kind of share with the other person what's evolving and changing and all these things, then yeah, you might kind of, a growing wedge might begin to form in the relationship. But as long as there's a general sense of like, this is what I'm learning, this is what's going on, this is what was enjoyable to me, this is what was less enjoyable to me, we continue to learn about each other by proxy. We continue to learn about each other through experiences separate from one another. And that is an essential counterbalancing force in any healthy relationship. Second caveat, it ebbs and flows. Let me be very clear. This is not like all healthy couples are perfectly balancing these two forces. More often than not, there are more self-exploratory independence pushes, and there are more kind of closed in, really just the dyad, or obviously it can be more than that, but just the inner circle, so to speak. And there's an ebb and flow between that. So it's not like you're constantly on. You constantly need to be engaging in these independent self-exploratory endeavors. But if it's been a while, it might be time to double check and switch things up and say, you know what, I need to do a little bit of me time. And that's an okay thing. That's an okay thing. As long as you're talking about, as long as there's kind of a communal agreement of like, yeah, this is healthy. This is healthy. So, so I guess this, hopefully that makes sense. I mean, this episode, I guess, is in a way about like enmeshment and the dangers of enmeshment, but also really highlighting the importance of independence in our life that fosters healthy relationships in our lives. I feel like there's a better word for this. There's interdependence out there. There's something clever, but I don't have time to think of it. So anyway, a real brief episode here, just talking about this thing that came up that I maybe is interesting to some folks, particularly those who are navigating dependence versus independence and the balance between those forces within a relationship. Yeah. And as always, I appreciate your time, I appreciate your curiosity, and be sure to stay curious.